Tuesday, February 24th, 2025, marked the third anniversary of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. On this anniversary, the United Nations General Assembly met to discuss war resolutions, as well as their support for the Ukrainian nation. Things are shifting fast, and we don't quite know what the future of the war will be. I'm your host, Alexandra Morar, a law student here at Queen's with the International Human Rights Law Program. And in today's episode, we will hear the first-hand account of human rights activist Brian Dooley, who has recently returned from Ukraine, where he investigated the killing of human rights defender Tigran Galustian. Brian is the senior advisor of the NGO Human Rights First, as well as an honorary professor of practice here at Queen's with the Mitchell Institute. Here's Brian to share his insight. Brian, would you like to say hi real quick?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on here. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Brian, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your role here at Queen's?
Yeah, I was awarded this honorary professor of practice the October before last, so a year and a bit. There isn't like an official job description. I come here on and off, give lectures, talk to students. In fact, I would say that the role is developing, right? And in a good way, it looks like there's a fair amount of scope. So I'm looking to engage actually even more. I write things for the website here. I've given a couple of lectures in the law school. I really like the engagement and being part, albeit peripheral part, of the Queen's family.
Yeah, definitely. And then as far as human rights go, you've written a few books and you have some experience with human rights as well. What got you first interested in working with human rights?
I mean, that's a long, bizarre story, really. I finished high school, didn't really get A-levels. It was 1981. I was shipped out really by my parents out of trouble. There was a lot of trouble going on in London, there was rioting. And I ended up with my uncle, who was a parish priest in apartheid South Africa. And so when I was 18, 19, I lived with him for a year in what was called blacks only township. So he and I were the only white people who lived there. And of course I got an instant and radical and transformative. Then I came back and went to university and did sort of more mainstream stuff. But from then, I mean, it was such a shocking, eye-opening window onto repression that I always wanted to do human rights work. I thought I'd be a journalist. I did that for a little while. Then I worked for Amnesty for almost 20 years and been at Human Rights First for 14 or so years.
Yeah. And is there anything striking about the career that stands out to you with human rights?
I'm not sure I would make a different choice if I was in my early 20s again. It's rarely been boring. Sometimes it is. I mean, sometimes you're sitting in front of an Excel sheet doing budgets. But most of the time it's been very stimulating. And over the last 15 years or so, more than that actually, probably 20 years, I've ended up, not really by choice, although I haven't minded, doing more and more work in conflict zones in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon during the wars. 2006, 2009, a lot of work in Ukraine, particularly over the last 3 years. And the work I've done over the last 3 years in Ukraine has been really on the Eastern Front, right up against where the fighting is. And I've been writing about the human rights work that's going on there. And I've thought that that was important to do because very few people are going that far east in Ukraine to document what's happening. Diplomats don't really go there. Most international NGOs don't go there. Not many journalists go there. So I want to write about and promote the work that local human rights activists are doing because it's not getting seen, and probably more importantly, it's not really getting resourced, in that they find it hard to raise money because no one's seeing what they're doing. So that's why I go back again and again. I've been mostly to the city of Kharkiv and the region around there, which is Ukraine's second biggest city. It's right over in the very far east, near the Russian border. And I've been there about every other month for the last 3 years or so, reporting mostly on what local activists are doing.
I'm glad you brought up the conflict zones, because from hearing stories with you previously, I just think it's impressive. You go right into the action, and a lot of politicians, even bystanders, right? It's so easy to post things on social media, but to actually put yourself in the danger and do help, I think is admirable. Can you give myself and listeners as well, for people who haven't been in Ukraine or Kharkiv during the conflict, what is it like? What do you see? What do you see as you walk along the streets as you're over there?
It's changed a little over the last 3 years with sort of some ups and downs, depending quite how close the Russian forces are to the city. In the first part of 22, they were really, the enemy at the gates. I mean, almost literally, where they were so close that there were artillery bombardments of the city. Then they were pushed back a little, well, actually quite far. They were pushed back 20 miles or so towards the end of 22. And then in the first part of 24, they moved back again, haven't quite reached the city. So that sort of in and out of the Russian troops really affects a lot of everyday life in the city. When they're far away, the city doesn't really go on as normal, in that there are still missile attacks, sometimes several times a day, several times a night. But as the Russian forces were, and now again are that bit closer, there's much more tension in the city. There's been, over the winters, those 3 winters, there's been a lack of electricity and heating because of Russian bombardments deliberately of that infrastructure to try to, make everything too cold for people to stay. So it's a strange mix of normal, in a sense. People are in cafes, they're in restaurants, there's even nightclubs, there's music concerts, there's theatre. Although much of that is literally underground now because it's much safer. So places which used to be just warehouse basements or shop basements are now being repurposed as cafes or makeshift concert halls. So a lot of normal-ish life goes on. On the other hand, there's still a curfew at 10 o'clock at night, and in the winter, it just gets dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and there's very little street lighting. So you're in this weird, in itself it isn't particularly frightening, but just, 3:30 in the afternoon, like everything is completely dark. People are walking around either with little torches or their phones to go around. And then at any time, the city can be hit by a missile. And because it's so close to the border, from where the missiles are being fired, you get little or no warning. So in Kyiv, which is in the middle of the country, also gets attacked by missiles. But when you're there, you get like a 15-minute warning or so that, there's missiles on the way. And by the time they travel the hundreds of miles, like across to the middle of Ukraine, you have time to go down into a shelter. And the air defenses in Kyiv, so those missiles which attack the incoming missiles, the defensive stuff, are really pretty good. 95+% of the incoming missiles from Russia get shot down. There's still some danger there from sort of the debris of that, but it's a very different picture in Kharkiv, where the defense system is much weaker. First of all, there just isn't as much. And secondly, and most importantly, really, there's virtually no warning. You hear a missile hit the city or several missiles hit the city, and then 30 seconds later, the app says, beware, there are missiles on the way. You're like, yeah, I know, I just heard. So Kharkiv is an odd place like that. It's not completely closed down, shut down like it was in the first half of 22. I mean, there's like a shopping mall, teenagers hanging out and people walking around the streets doing normal stuff. But it's not a normal city. There's a city at war and making the best of it. So it's a sort of a strange place to be.
It really surprises me that normal life continues. Can you really picture nightlife going on, cafes? So when you work with human rights defenders to rescue civilians when it does get too dangerous, why do you think people stay until the last minute?
There's a lot of human rights activism going on in Kharkiv, and for me it's very interesting because a lot of it is new. People who are doing humanitarian work, there's an architect who's refitting a building to make it into an old people's home. The LGBTQ groups there now, which were mostly focused on advocacy a couple of years ago, are now providing humanitarian aid. And then there are other people like the team of those who evacuate people from the front line that I work with often now, who were not really civil society volunteers a few years ago. They see the crisis and they want to respond to it. So the situation is along the eastern front, near Kharkiv, but also south of Kharkiv is the Donetsk region. And all along the eastern front, there are villages and towns and cities which are at the front line. And people have been advised and then ordered over the months by the Ukrainian government to leave because it's just too dangerous. And most people do, and some people don't. Some people refuse to leave, ever. But then there are people who really want to stay as long as they can. They're often elderly people, they're often women. And they say, I've lived in this house for 80 plus years. My parents did before me. If I leave it, I think I'm never going to come back to it. They're fairly desperate to stay. But then at some point when the fighting gets so close to them, in the streets around them, or their street is getting shelled, they say, come and get me, come and rescue me. I work with this team. I'm only there every couple of months. They're doing it virtually every day. They get a list of people who want to be evacuated the next day. The sort of deal is, if you want to be evacuated, you call a hotline, and within 24 hours, somebody comes to get you, or at least tries their hardest to get you, which they nearly always do manage to get you. You've got to be ready the next day. Say your appointment is 11 in the morning. You've got to be ready. You're only allowed to bring a few bags. Then you show up in a village, in a town which is being bombed. Ideally, the person, or sometimes there's a group of people, sometimes it's a family, are really ready to go. And that's when it works well. You drive up in your van, open the door, they get in, and you drive out as fast as you can, because the longer that you're there, the more dangerous it is, and the more likely it is that you're going to get hit by a missile or drone. But often, actually, in practice, people are very reluctant to actually walk away from their home for what they believe will be the last time. So you turn up, and often people sort of make an excuse to go into every room one last time. It's interesting psychologically to see, and you don't really want to hurry people up there. So it varies. Sometimes you can go in and get 1 or 2 or 3 people in a day. Other times you can go and get a couple of dozen people, just depending how many people want to leave. I mean, it's true too that sometimes people say, okay, come and get me, 2:00 tomorrow afternoon. And when you show up, they've changed their mind. They won't leave. Or when you show up in a place expecting to get 1 person or 2 people, their neighbours see the chance to escape, and they ask if they can cram in the van too. And so, yes, of course. It's very unpredictable in a lot of ways, not least the danger, but in terms of who you're going to get. And then what happens is you bring these people back to the city of Kharkiv. Some have relatives, so they've sort of got a next step take in terms of beginning a new life. Others have no relatives, and so they get taken to like a central, reception centre hostel. It's a converted old school. And they get given some provisions, but it's not a great step for them. And you understand why people are reluctant to leave their home, albeit it's super dangerous there. You bring them to the relative safety of the city of Kharkiv, but first of all, that's not totally safe. And then what future do they have then, really? They're living in a hostel. Yeah, they're safer, but, they don't know people there. It's all very strange for them. They may not really be used to living in a city. So it's not quite a straightforward a choice for people of, oh, well, I'm living in a very dangerous place. I'll just go somewhere else and life will be great, because, the new challenges when they leave the dangerous place. That's what I'm doing some of the time I'm there. I like to promote that work, to write about it, because a lot of that sort of local activism goes underreported and unseen, because not many people will go to Kharkiv to the front for security reasons. So diplomats don't go, international human rights organizations generally don't go, not many journalists go. So that fantastic life-saving work is being done by local volunteers. They need money because they need petrol. The vehicles get damaged and hit sometimes by missiles, and they need people to contribute to pay for that stuff. They need flak jackets, they need helmets, they need first aid equipment. And without any publicity, it's very difficult for them to raise that money. So that's part of the use of me going there when I go and write about local activists, whether it's them or other people doing other types of activism. They can use the reports that I write to go and fundraise. And I think that's a good use of my time and my work.
No, I think so too. And I think it means a lot to the individuals leaving the house. You guys treat them in a loving way. You're going to rescue them, but you give them the option, okay, take a final walk through your house, right? Because you have to leave behind photo albums, wedding photos, childhood memories. If their life was in that house, they're all leaving that behind. Do you think, is there a way to get more people into that kind of rescue work?
It's becoming much more difficult to recruit people to do that sort of work. Partly it's very dangerous, but now since April of last year, the Ukrainian authorities have embarked on a very enthusiastic conscription drive. Men aged between 25 and 59 are liable to be conscripted into the army. The Ukrainian army is very short of soldiers, particularly for the infantry, to fight on the front line. And so you see in the cities that I go to, Kyiv a bit, and absolutely because I spend most of my time in Kharkiv, you see groups of police and soldiers roaming the streets, the underground, the subway, in and out of cafes, in and out of buses, literally grabbing men to put them into the army. They come for me sometimes, not realizing that I'm not Ukrainian. And there are many men who are in hiding from the army. Many believe that going to the army is super dangerous because the reputation of much of the army is that it's not very professional, that they'll be undertrained, under-equipped, and sent into impossible situations. So many men are hiding from the army. And so the men who were prepared to do this volunteer rescue operations, going into villages under fire and evacuating people to safety, have either now been taken into the army, or some of them are staying at home because if they go out onto the street, or when you go to the front line, you have to go through a few checkpoints to get there. And at any one of these checkpoints, these guys can just be taken out of the vehicle and put into the army. The number of people who are doing these evacuations has been drastically reduced because they're either been taken into the army or they're hiding from the army. And really, it's sort of a crisis because they can't really be readily replaced. Now, women can replace them in that women can't be conscripted. By and large, women don't do that work. Partly, I think that's to do with an element of physical strength, or at least that's what the volunteers will tell you. Sometimes you go to a place and you have to carry people, sometimes in wheelchairs, down lots of flights of steps. So it's not impossible for women to do. I've been with local activists who are women who don't do the evacuation work. They do similar work where they go into a community and bring medical aid or food. And they do that also highly dangerous, equally dangerous work into communities under fire. But they tend not to do the work where you're carrying people out. Maybe more women will feel they have to do that if there just aren't enough men to do that. But yeah, it's a crisis at the moment. We tend to go in twos in case somebody gets injured. You need really two drivers. The roads are awful, so the chances of you getting a flat tire or damage to your car are very high. The roads are awful because most of the roads aren't really built for war. I mean, they're not built for tanks or heavy military equipment, and so they're not built to be hit by missiles. So driving around those roads to Kupiansk or Pokrovsk or wherever it is, the roads there are just torn up and it's very slow going. I mean, the potholes and the roads are scarred. It does a lot of damage to the vehicles, and that's very expensive. And that's just many, many challenges that these evacuation teams have, including most recently taken and put in the army.
And I'm sure, too, as danger increases, numbers go down as well. So, Brian, as you're helping out with these extractions, was there a particular individual, a particular family or experience that really stood out to you?
So I haven't done so many of them that it's a blur, right? Like it is for these other guys who have evacuated hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands of people over the last year. So I remember all of them. There are a few. There's one where we went to evacuate a family from a very small village, and the mum, it was like a mum and dad and two teenage kids. And the mum had got completely dressed up in a really like fancy red outfit because this was like a big day, right? The evacuation day. And I mean, she looked very different to the rest of us. So we were like, covered in mud and dust and dirt, and this very glamorous woman in bright red. I always remember that. I remember too, though, going to a village near Pokrovsk down in Donetsk, where we've been to a few villages. The way it worked was there was a sort of a central gathering place for these evacuees, and you'd start there and you'd go, 10 or 15 miles or whatever to a village and then bring them back to this place. And then you'd go another 10 or 15 miles a slightly different direction and bring more people back. So you're sort of shuttling backwards and forwards to this central place over the day, as long as daylight was there. And we went to a place to pick up an elderly woman. And she was with her son, who was 55. And I don't know what conversation they'd had beforehand, but she expected him to go with her. She expected that they were both leaving. And when it came to it, he refused to go. He refused to go because, being under 60, he's liable to military conscription. And so his choice was to stay in this village, which was about to get overrun, has been since, by Russian soldiers, and then take his chances with them under occupation, or to come back with us. But if we take him back to the city of Kharkiv, then he's liable to be put into the Ukrainian army. And so what you want to happen when you turn up to rescue somebody is for them to be ready and just jump in the van and go. I mean, you go there because it's a dangerous place and you want to get them out, but you don't want to be lingering around. The more you're hovering around there, the longer a time you risk being spotted and then attacked by a Russian drone or missile. And so this woman and her son were having a stand-up argument out on the street. They were both crying and arguing. She was saying, you have to come with me. And he's saying, no, I won't, because, then I'll get put in the army. And it was frightening because we were there for nearly 20 minutes. And, you can't kidnap people and put them in a van, right? While we were waiting, actually, a very smart street dog saw his opportunity and jumped into the van, self-evacuated, right, and got himself to safety. But eventually, after almost 20 minutes, the son agreed to go. And so we brought them both back to Kharkiv. I don't know if he was conscripted or not, but that stands out to me. I think that's the most frightened I was, because the more you're there just standing out in the street, the more exposed you are. And I felt very vulnerable then. What we thought would be a quick in and out turned into this family, real drama. When I think about it, I still get scared. That's the one that sticks with me the longest, I guess.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to shift the conversation because we recently did lose a human rights defender. So with the International Human Rights Law Program, you published a report on the killing of human rights defender Tigran Galustian. I'm very thankful to have helped play a little part in that. It's really convincing reading the report, seeing the outlines, and for listeners of Law Pod, I'll include a link to the report as well. But Brian, can you explain a little bit about what you know of Tigran's life as a human rights defender and his role in Kharkiv?
Thank you. And really, I want to use this opportunity to thank the students who worked on that report at the end of last year. They did a lot of work in a short amount of time. It was marvelous. There was quite a big team of them broken into 3 sub-teams, one looking at the open source intelligence around the killing of Tigran, others looking at the accountability mechanisms and the possible chains of command and what the relevant international law was. That was a huge help to us in writing that report. So what happened was, in October, the Russian military made some slow but very steady advances south of the Kharkiv region into the Donetsk region, around a smallish city, Pokrovsk. And while there are people in that area who wanted to be evacuated, there just wasn't really local volunteer teams to do that. So the team from Kharkiv that I worked with offered to help, although it's sort of outside of its general remit. And so they, including me, drove down to south to the Donetsk. It took about 5 hours to get there. And we did evacuations, I think the first couple of days in October. It evacuated quite a lot of people, dozens and dozens over the day, ourselves and another couple of teams. And then I left and went home, and a couple of days later, they were still working there. And there was this guy, Tigran, who was part of the team, an Armenian guy, a couple of Armenians actually in the team. And he went with one of the other guys I know, Danilo. And when they were between villages, about to go and rescue a family, including a baby, unusually, they were tracked by a Russian drone. And as we saw from the social media, which was posted afterwards, the drone hovered over the van and then fired down from the very top of the van, above the driver's head, and down into the van. And Tigran happened to be driving, and you take turns in driving, right? So he was killed. And there was, apart from the social media footage of that, was taken by the drone. You see the drone's eye view of it. Then the guy with him, Danilo, also had, as many of us do, one of those GoPro cameras sort of on you the whole time. And so there was that footage. So we saw fairly graphically, really, what happened. And my interest was then, what can happen, even in theory, in terms of trying to hold somebody accountable? It's a war crime, right? Deliberately killing civilian is, no question, is a war crime, whether it's a human rights activist or not. And so we explored with the Queen's students avenues for possible accountability. You have to say, in practice, it's highly unlikely. It's possible if you could identify either the drone operator or somebody higher up that chain of command who gave the order or allowed them to do that. If you could identify them, you might be able to bring them to court. You'd have to capture them first in Ukraine. In theory, the Russian military could prosecute its own soldiers. That's highly unlikely to happen. So in terms of the frustration, of course, of somebody being murdered, killed like that is huge. And then there's another layer, I think, the frustration of, whoever did it is likely to get away with it. So that was what the report was about, and the exploration of, is it possible to hold anybody to account? I didn't know Tigran very well personally. We were part of this wider team, tend for whatever reason to go, as I say, in pairs, usually with one or two of the others. So I certainly knew him, seen him around, been on some of these rescues with him, but he wasn't particularly a personal friend. He had been working in and around Kharkiv as a mechanic and a driver, and he had been doing these evacuations for 8 or 9 months, and was known, as with the rest of this team is called the Rose on Hand team, started as a search and rescue group of volunteers actually, and was known as one of these guys who was prepared to go where others weren't prepared to go. But yeah, it was sort of shocking, although, of course that could always happen to any of them. And, his case, what happened to him, of course, is being used as an example of just how dangerous this is. And those guys who do this work, they're not too scared to do this sort of work, but they are too scared to go in the army because they think actually going in the army brings different, greater risks that they can't control.
I'm glad you got into the likelihood a little bit of trying to find justice for Tigran. That was going to be one of my questions, because even recently, back in December, you went to Kharkiv, and I believe you were able to ask maybe members of the Rose on Hand team or other witnesses just about the attack, how it was a targeting, how the van was clearly marked, yet was still bombed, and Tigran, unfortunately, was killed. So after going to Kharkiv and interviewing people that were affiliated with Tigran, was there anything surprising you learned about the attack or anything about Tigran's life that stood out to you?
Thank you. It's a great question. What was sort of surprising to me was, I guess, the mundaneness of it, if you like. I mean, I've been in that van lots of times. I've been, with Danilo, the guy that he was with, lots of times. And these drives are sometimes long. I mean, when you get to a village, you're hurtling in and out as fast as you can because it's being bombed. But to get to that front line can take, as I say, if you're going down to where they were, sort of 5 hours. So there's a lot of just sitting around in a van or a car, generally empty roads because there's nothing there except a few military vehicles. So it's not boring, but it's fairly mundane. And I spoke to Danilo, who was with Tigran when the attack happened. And Danilo was injured himself. I mean, he was sitting, next to the driver, and because they drive on the right-hand side in Ukraine, right? The passenger seat means it's the right-hand seat. And Danilo, when the missile came through the roof, killed Tigran, and Danilo was hurt on his left side, his left arm, his left leg, and has lost hearing, and he doesn't know if that's permanent or not in his left ear. So I guess what was surprising listening to Danilo was just how sort of an ordinary day it was. They were just, as ordinary as that life is, right? They're just going from one village. They went to a village, whatever happened, the person didn't show up, or they didn't actually rescue anybody from that village. They do, by the way, also pick up stray cats and dogs sometimes. So he said they'd picked up a few cats, right? But they were on their way to go and get this family, which included, unusually, a baby. And they had no sense that they were being followed. Most of the time, there's a little thing about the size of a mobile phone, really, called a sugar cube, a Zakharov, which we use in the vehicles, which really tells you if there's a drone overhead. In fact, it beeps to say there's a drone overhead, and then a few minutes later, it can actually even tell you what it is. Like if it's a Ukrainian drone or a Russian drone, it's pretty sophisticated. The thing's quite cheap, costs about $100. But if for some reason that didn't pick up the drone, he didn't hear it, and it came from behind. When you're driving, when you get to that very front line, you are looking in the skies all the time to look out for these drones. So Danilo says they didn't hear it, they didn't see it, and it just really came out of nowhere. So that was sort of sobering and shocking for me, that in a sort of an everyday trip like that, there's always a danger, but for it to actually happen and kill one of the team was, it sounds ridiculous to say it was surprising because it shouldn't be, but it still was surprising. And then something actually which I still couldn't really get an answer to, although I asked lots of times, was Tigran was known as one of the couple of Armenians, right? And I'm sort of interested in Armenia. I've been there a few times. I still couldn't and still can't quite understand how Armenian he was or wasn't. Like, was he legally Armenian? When he was buried, his coffin had an Armenian flag over it. It certainly is 100% an Armenian name. But I still don't know. It's weird. People sort of don't know that about him and don't think that's what particularly matters, like what passport he had or not. Although from a legal point of view, actually, I was interested in it to see if he had been a foreign national, would that open any other accountability avenues? I don't know if it would have. So I'm going back again in a few weeks, and I'll see if I can dig out a little bit more about how Armenian Tigran was or wasn't. I don't know much about his personal life. He has a 6-year-old daughter, still living in the city with her grandmother. Oddly, he had his own car, normal car that didn't really use for rescues, right? So when he died, the team bought that car. And last time I was there, I was using his car to do some of these evacuations, right? And when I was driving his car, I realised, he was in his 30s, like a cool guy he was, right? He had like these tinted windows, which is like desperately unhelpful when you're doing evacuations and you're looking around for drones, right? He's got the most amazing sound system in his car, right? He's like super cool. And when I was trying to get the headlights on and off, it turns out he's rigged up, with these like flashing lights at the front. I mean, it's total like disco car, right? Which is the least appropriate thing when you're trying not to attract attention to yourself at this thing. So yeah, it's odd getting in his car to do this work, knowing that a few months ago he was using it to like drive around the city and be cool.
Yeah, and it is interesting to look at war times, right? I mean, you just had a normal life, and then you're pulled into this human rights defender rescue team action just to see if he had this normal car and then was pulled out of it. For students or academics listening, is there anything that we can do or you think we should do to help bring justice for Tigran or to help bring justice for war crimes?
Right, I think we're edging on the edge of a new phase now in Ukraine where much talk of a peace deal, negotiations, and I think ideas around how to protect human rights issues in any future deal will be very useful. Actually, I think this is where academics, students, wherever they are, can contribute, I think, usefully to discussion around the specifics of Ukraine. I mean, that's really for the Ukrainian people to decide, right? But ideas around the specifics of what a peace deal should and shouldn't look like. So, for instance, as part of a peace deal, is it okay that the killers of Tigran just absolutely officially get away with it? Like, even if they're ever found, they can't be prosecuted, right? Is that okay? There are other human rights issues in there too. What about how Ukraine deals with people accused of collaborating with the Russians? It's a very sensitive, very tricky issue. There are issues around Ukrainian children who were taken into Russia. That's also much more layered and complicated than generally been presented in the Western media. I've done some work on that issue too. But what happens there as part of a peace deal? Is Russia going to say, well, we're going to keep whatever children we've taken? Or you say, no, that's a human rights issue. These kids have a right to return to their families if they want. So I think on the specifics of what Ukraine deal might look like, all of us in the international human rights community have an interest there, I think, to try to make sure that the human rights issues aren't traded away in a political deal, not just for what's fair for Ukraine, but then also for future conflicts too. Like, are any of these human rights standards really going to matter in future in conflict if, at the end of the conflict, they just get bartered away as part of a political deal? So I do think there's a moment this year for academics really to discuss and suggest what might be useful in terms of safeguarding human rights issues in a longer-term peace deal.
I want to ask you, Brian, you brought up this idea of a sense of mundaneness for the Rose on Hand team. It's normal. You put your life on the line, and then all of a sudden, it's normal to have that threat of danger. Why do you yourself, knowing the sense of danger and then seeing how it might even be discouraging, the reports out, but what is the likelihood of Russia seeking accountability, trying to seek justice? Why do you keep going back and continuing this work?
That would be a very difficult and deep question if I had a mind which was capable of analysing things in much depth. And honestly, I think I'm gifted in being fairly shallow. I don't mean that at all facetiously. I mean, to me, things are pretty simple. I get to Kharkiv. I know the deal, that there are people who want to be evacuated, they want to be rescued the next day. I can drive, and I know that I can stay calm enough in a situation to drive for 2-3 hours, get some people and bring them out. And any panic, but any stress or any fear I have comes later. And that's fine because that doesn't threaten what I'm doing at the time. So I don't think about it much more deeply than that. I mean, that's the equation there. You're going to stay in the city knowing that if you don't go, these people are at tremendous risk, or you're going to go and do it. And when I'm there, when somebody asks to be evacuated, I think the more difficult choice is to say no. Because then, you're wandering around all day and the next day and for the next weeks and months thinking, well, I didn't do that and I should have, right? So that may sound a fairly superficial reasoning, but I don't mind that. I mean, I think that's the right thing to do. I think those guys, and me a little bit too, sometimes get judged as, I think unfairly, as though you're some sort of adrenaline junkie, and I'm not, they're not. And it's a very different experience for them doing it virtually every day. They clearly have mental health challenges, which they're very open about. Although it's mundaneness, but I mean, the mundaneness is everyday living with a very high level of stress and danger. And you just can't do that for very long without it affecting, right? So it's difficult for them mentally. They sometimes take breaks. They are offered counseling, therapy, and I think in the beginning, some of them were reluctant to take it, and now they just realize if they're going to keep doing this, they need to use those services because it makes them more efficient in the long run. It's not about the thrill of the high of, isn't this exciting when you're going in and bombs are going around? It's terrifying and it's not fun. And I don't want to say it's an addiction. It's not, because that makes it sound unhealthy. And I think what they're doing is great. But the appeal of doing it is really knowing that if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it. And again, I don't want to make it sound too shallow, but it's as simple as that. That's why they do it, and certainly that's why I do it.
Well, thank you for joining us, Brian. It's been lovely having a conversation with you and discussing everything going on in Ukraine. We wish you the best of luck as you prepare for your next journey there to continue to help. And thank you all for listening to LawPod.
Thank you very much.